Hey there, biologists. Today's video is going to cover branch lengths, specifically what the branch lengths mean on a cladogram, a time-calibrated phylogeny, and a genetic distance phylogeny. We will also have a very brief discussion about the molecular clock. So let's just hop right into it. Realistically, this video is a primer on the different types of phylogenetic trees. So let's first start with a cladogram. Cladograms are simply phylogenies where the branch lengths are meaningless, meaning that this branch length here has no real difference from this branch length or really any of the branch lengths. These phylogenies are just used to show the relationships between internal nodes and the tips. Before I show you time-calibrated and genetic distance phylogenies, we need to stop and talk about the molecular clock. Now, I'm realizing that I need to make an entire video on the molecular clock, so this is going to be a very simplified explanation. We know that all genetic material has a baseline mutation rate. That would be the number of mutations we would expect to see every generation. This number is usually extremely small. We're talking about one mutation in every billion base pairs per generation, so very, very, very tiny. But imagine if we have something crazy, it's like a 20% chance every generation, something like 0.2. On a sequence like AAA, 5 A's, we would expect then 1 in 5, 20%, would have some mutation for the next for the next generation. So in that case, this would be our F starting point, our first generation here. And we would say one generation, right? We're just making a hypothetical example. And I promise this has extreme relevance for phylogenies. So we now know that, cool, we have one mutation every generation or so on this sequence. Well, if we know that the generation time is something like 10 years, just to keep these numbers simple, 10 years. Maybe this is some small rodent species that, lives and reproduces generations every 10 years. We can then backtrack and say, well, based on these two sequences, we can actually predict about how far back they diverged from, based on the number of mutations that they are differing from each other. And then we can use that information to date our phylogenies. If we know that from sequence A up here to the proposed ancestor down here, that we have two changes, right? We would assume that there were two mutations somewhere along its evolutionary history. If we know there's only one mutation on average per generation, we could say that, okay, their ancestor was 2 generations ago. Again, this is a massive, massive oversimplification, and the actual mathematical models are far more complex than this. But what we're really saying is that the molecular clock can tell us roughly how far back something occurred based on the mutations that we see. So there are a few caveats with the molecular clock that we'll cover in greater detail later on, but here's a few I think you should know. One, the molecular clock varies between the different branches of life. Obviously, a goose is not going to have the same molecular clock or generation time as a bacteria. So that is something to definitely keep in mind. Those are like super disparate examples, but even more closely related taxa will have vastly different molecular clocks. Additionally, they will change with time, and they will change with different selective pressures, different forces that are influencing the clades. These are largely accounted for in many of the phylogenetic methods, but it is something that you need to be aware of when using molecular clocks. Now let's talk about a time-calibrated phylogeny. Now, a time-calibrated phylogeny is a bit self-descriptive. It is a phylogeny calibrated to time, which means that these branch lengths, here we have them in these blue numbers, represent time. Most often, they're going to be millions of years of evolutionary history, but some studies do thousands of years, depending on the study. There are a couple nuances with these branch lengths. One is that they are additive. So if we are looking at this most recent common ancestor for all of these taxa here, if you'll notice, 3 plus 2 equals 5. all of the tips on the phylogeny have been evolving for the same amount of time, right? They've diverged. They diverged from this most recent common ancestor, and they had to diverge at the same time, naturally, because they were the same common ancestor. And since then, they have been diverging for the same amount of time. So on these phylogenies, distance is measured in time. Now, the way we actually build time-calibrated phylogenies involves a little bit of that molecular clock information that we talked about, but it involves calibrating the phylogeny to known time points in history. And the two primary ways we do that is through fossil evidence and biogeographic history. Let's say we just had a cladogram. We were able to figure out the actual relationships between our tips, but we now want to time calibrate it. What we do is we look for fossil evidence first. And we can look for fossil evidence of this ancestor here, A. We'll just call it A. Well, the great thing about fossils is that they are often embedded in the earth. And many parts of the earth have layers. So what happens is we end up finding some fossil of A, let's say in this layer here. And because of the way dirt deposits on the earth, which is from the top, more dirt will get piled onto the top here, create a new layer here, new layer here. We are able to say that this region right here, this strata layer, may be 5 million years ago. Now, when we actually build out phylogenies, we don't often use these exact numbers. We actually use probability distributions. So we'll say it's 5 million years, give or take 2 million years on either side. So just keeping that in mind. But because we know this fossil was found here and we have reasonable certainty that it was deposited on this Earth X number of years ago, 5 million years ago, we can then use that to tether this phylogeny here. We know that this most recent common ancestor existed in its current form, or in that most recent common ancestor form, 5 million years ago. So this phylogeny is now centered on that point. So this is how I like to visualize time calibration. Imagine if this string is the phylogeny and it's in that cladogram state where the branch lengths mean nothing. Well, right now, this length, it means nothing. It can move around, right? When we time calibrate it though, it's sort of like grabbing this string that's moving everywhere at a single point. And now this string can only move between certain points, right? We may not know if it's this length yet or this length yet without some other molecular clock information or maybe more fossils, but we can be reasonably certain that this point here happened roughly 5 million years ago, right? And so the goal is to have many of these constraining points. So maybe between point A and point B, it's this much, and then you find another internal node, you find another fossil, and then you can say, okay, maybe this is only 1 million years ago. We have relatively good proof of that. But the fossil evidence wasn't enough to get you as calibrated as you would like. So you decide to look at node B over here and see if there are any biogeographic events that could calibrate this phylogeny even further. Biogeographic events simply describe events that have changed the distribution of organisms. They could be stuff like the glaciers receding during the last ice age, thus allowing more habitats for organisms to disperse into, or they can be barriers to dispersal, such as the Isthmus of Panama and the connection between Mesoamerica and South America. Yeah, so imagine if this were some island and mainland species. So we have the mainland here, and then we have an island here. We'll make the island look like this. And for all intents and purposes, these organisms aren't birds. They're not flying between it. Maybe they're lizards, and it's very difficult for them to cross between the mainland and the island. But during repeated events in history, the sea levels have changed. And what that's caused are different time periods where the island and the mainland are connected, allowing for dispersal between either. So what you can say is that, hey, this group here, maybe up at this phylogeny, up at this node, let's zoom in on our example phylogeny. Maybe what you are seeing is this taxa is only found on the island, and this taxa next to it is only found on the mainland. So you say, well, they had to have diverged at some point where there was a cutoff from the island to the mainland, so that there's reproductive isolation. And you know that the last time the island was cut off was maybe a million years ago. So maybe you know that a million years ago it looked more like this, and we no longer have the dispersal between mainland and island. You can use this as another calibration point along with your fossil evidence. And usually these are major, super well-known geographic events, so they are usually well supported in the literature. So to sum all of this up, a time-calibrated phylogeny takes genetic information and the relationships between taxa, and then calibrates those diverging points according to known fossil and biogeographic information. And now let's do genetic distance phylogenies. These are also self-descriptive. They are phylogenies that show relationships between organisms according to how genetically similar or dissimilar they are to one another. And on that topic of similar or dissimilar, just know there are a wide variety of metrics to actually measure that. And indeed, many phylogenies use these variety of methods. So if you're ever critiquing a phylogeny or looking to understand it further, just know precisely what metric they are using to calculate distance. Now, I know I'm just popping a matrix on the screen, but this is actually how many distance-based phylogenies work. This is a distance matrix that is comparing all of the tips, all of the genetic information contained within the tips of the phylogeny, and saying how similar or dissimilar they are to one another. In this case, we have already excluded the ones above the diagonal because those are duplicates, and along the diagonal, we always have a value of 1 for this matrix. And that's because we are comparing tip A to tip A, and they are perfectly identical because they are the same tip, right? Same with B and C and C. They are identical, so of course they're going to have a value of 1. But these distance matrices, what they do is that they then compare A to B, and they say how genetically similar or dissimilar are those sequences to one another. And you may find that it's a value of, let's just say, 0.9, right? In this metric, we are just saying they are 90% similar. And then we could do that for all the other combinations, which would be A and C, as well as B and C. So if we have A and C, let's just give these arbitrary values of 0.7, and let's give B and C 0.8. So this is a very, very simplified distance matrix. So if we want to actually show you what this looks like, let's compare B and C. Let's just say that B was a nucleotide sequence that was all T's, right? You would probably never use this for an actual phylogeny, but just humor me. Because B and C in this distance matrix, we're talking about how similar the genetic sequences are. B and C are 0.8, right? They have 80% similarity in this matrix. So we could say that C is maybe a sequence that is like T, 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 and then just A, one difference. So 80% of the genetic sequence are shared, but 20% is how much they differ by, right? So that's just one example of a distance matrix. And from this, we can build a phylogeny. If we take this genetic distance matrix and make a very crude phylogeny, we can actually create a basic cladogram, right? So we know that here A and B are very similar to each other. They have a value of 0.9 on a scale of 0 to 1. They are very similar. So they are very likely a sister group, right? And on this phylogeny, B is more similar to A than it is to C, right? It's a value of 0.9 versus 0.8. Now, of course, there are things like convergent evolution or mutations, which then mutate back into their ancestral form, but the more advanced methods do account for this, the more advanced models do account for this. We are simplifying dramatically. You would also probably use more than 5 nucleotide sequences to make your phylogeny. So if we want to finish out this phylogeny, we would just see that C is likely a sister to A and B, and that's just because A and B are so similar to one another, right? Going back to that 0.9 value. So we'd finish out the phylogeny like this. But this is just a cladogram. We are just mapping the relationships, and the branch lengths still mean nothing. So the genetic distance phylogeny will then look at that matrix and then try to infer the actual distance of the branches, the actual lengths of these branches, right? We said that A and B are very similar to one another, which would indicate that they would have probably very short branches. These branches are already pretty short, but just for demonstrative purposes, we're going to make them even shorter. The actual methods would provide real numbers. We're just going with examples here. And we also see here that C is very different than A and B. So in these cases, we would actually have C having a longer branch because they are more different, right? So we could have something that looks like this. So of course, one big tell of genetic distance phylogenies are that the tips don't line up with one another. You could see that here, A and B are lined up, and maybe that's not even accurate, but C is very, very high up. So that's because, well, sometimes they have more evolutionary distance between them. So to just summarize on a genetic distance phylogeny, they take all of the information from the tips that we give them, so in this case A, B, and C. They then are able to say how genetically similar or dissimilar the tips are to one another. From there, they can create a cladogram showing how these tips are related to each other. And then finally, they can apply some branch length metric in terms of how diverged they are from one another, or really just how different are these tips are based on the genetic information contained within them. Now, of course, I can't cover every nuance, caveat, and limitation of these phylogenies in this video. That's something I want to save for future videos, particularly one just on time-calibrated trees, one just on genetic distance, so we can really dive into them more deeply. But right now, this playlist is all about the absolute fundamentals, and we will keep building them up until you are an expert at reading and understanding phylogenetic trees. So if you found this video valuable, make sure to subscribe, share it with your friends, and have a wonderful day. Thank you. If you want to take your tree reading skills to the next level, my 3-part program, Reading Phylogenies, might just be for you. This program covers the core components of phylogenetic trees, phylogenetic groups and what they mean, as well as common misconceptions and misunderstandings when it comes to reading phylogenies. All of my courses contain video lectures, written text, as well as quizzes and mastery checks designed to cement your understanding of the concepts. You can find the link down in the description. Thank you.